All right, we are live. Welcome, everybody. My name is Justin Meyer, and we are going to start doing another Bitovi free weekly JavaScript training. With me, for the first time, is Mark Stahl.
Hello, everyone.
Mark, where are you coming from?
Savannah, Georgia.
And what are you working on lately?
I just got back from paternity leave. I just had a beautiful daughter, and so I'm working on some of the open source stuff with Dun.js.
Is she a really aggressive eater? Is that why? Was she like gnawing on your nose?
No, that was a body surfing accident where I lowered my head too low and decided to scrape it along the sand. It was really smart.
Sounds fun. Okay, so I'm going to jump right into it. Start sharing my screen. And if you are just joining us, you can follow along or chat with us at GitterIM Bitovi JS training. You can post questions here, and I will, during these, I'll answer any questions people ask, and then at the end, if there's old questions that I haven't seen that happened between this and last week, I will do my best to answer them. So Pyrox, I will get to your question at the end of this talk. Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk about events. Oh, one other thing I forgot to mention. I posted this in the Gitter room, but the demo that we will be coding today is at JSBin, and I guess I could read it, DEQIFEVIBO/1. You can follow along there to see the output of what I'm going to be programming. I'm going to be creating jQuery's bind method. But it's much easier to find that link in the Gitter room. Okay, Mark, can you see the? Can you see
Yep,
my?
we're good to go. Yep, full screen.
Good. Okay, so with events, events is probably, we talked about last time how in JavaScript or with client-side programming, there's really only three things that you need to do ever. Fundamentally, there's get data, which is you do with AJAX requests, which we haven't talked about yet, which we will get to, but that's a very minor and simple one. The next is you need to be able to, once you get your data, you want to be able to kind of present that to the user. So you need to be able to write out HTML and style that HTML and move your elements around on the page. So to kind of show the user what needs to be shown. And that's what we've pretty much talked about for the last couple of weeks, was how to manipulate the DOM to get it to look the way that you want it to look. And then finally, you need to listen to when things happen, when the user clicks around, when they hit the back button, and that's done through events. So events is really, if there's a three puzzle piece, we talked about the biggest puzzle piece, which was the DOM. Now we're going to talk about the second biggest puzzle piece, which are events, how to listen to events. So we'll learn how to listen to events. We'll talk about the different types of events. We'll probably talk a little bit about what event data comes, when an event happens, what you can find out about the event, which is the events data. And then next week, we'll talk about how events actually move through the document. There's a lot of subtlety there, and a lot of important and useful information that you need to know when you're doing any advanced JavaScript programming. But for today, we're going to go through a lot of the basics and then end with writing jQuery's bind function. So the first thing to learn is how to listen to events. So the DOM on an element provides these add event listener and remove event listener methods, where you can provide the type of event you want to listen to. Say I want to listen to when a user clicks the page. I can put click in here and a function to call back. when that click happens. This final argument, use capture, is a Boolean that controls on which phase of event propagation this handler should be registered. If that doesn't make sense, that's fine. We'll explain that next week. So registering an event handler looks like this. You get an element. In this case, I could get my breeds element and add an event listener click and pass it a function that will get called back whenever I click breeds. This will be inside this function. This function will be called with such that this is the element that was clicked on. And you notice here I passed false. That's what you want to pass almost every single time when you're using add event listener. So let's check this out in a fiddle. I'm going to create a new one though.
Justin.
Yeah.
Since you had annotated that the use capture argument was optional, what's the default?
The default is false.
Okay.
But I think you had to provide it in some old browsers, so I always write in false. But I think modern browsers, you don't really have to worry about that. It'll default to false everywhere. Okay, so where was I? JS bin. And I'm going to create a new JS bin. Oh, no. Go like this. Okay, so I had my breeds element. I got breeds over here, and I can get that element. And if I do element.add event listener, I want to listen to click. So when someone clicks on breeds, I'm going to pass it a function. And we'll write false. And let's do actually I'm going to increase my font size. I know people have complained about that before. And here I'm just going to alert you clicked it. Here, that works. So George is commenting. Thanks, George. Use capture became optional only in more recent versions of the major browsers. For example, it was not optional prior to Firefox Sys. Yeah, okay, yeah, good. That kind of reinforces what I was saying, is that you should still probably provide false, at least for maybe a couple more years. Definitely if you're writing a framework, you should do that, because yeah, use capture is only optional in modern browsers. Thanks for confirming that for me. So now let's just take a quick look in here. If I were to put a debugger in here. Oh, let me open up DevTools. Same unexpected token, but I don't know if that's because. Okay, so if I put a debugger in here, let me push past this. I'm going to put my event in here. But because I'm not using it, is that on? Why isn't it not? I think it's maybe because I've got, if I can trick it. Not. It is smarter than me. Hold on one second.
It wasn't updating in the console either, or in the inspect element information.
Yeah.
The argument is missing.
Yeah. Okay, now I've tricked it. Okay. So this add event listener gets called with one argument, and it gets called, and as every function is always called with some value for this. In this case, when you're adding an event listener, like I mentioned earlier, this is always going to be the element that the event, that you listen to the event, or the how do I say this? Okay, I'm gonna come back to this, but this is a really important point that I want to make right now while I'm talking about what this is that the element that the event actually occurred on might not be the element whose handlers are currently being dispatched. So let me make that more clear by giving a better example. So let's say I have a div here, and I'm going to give that some, I'm going to give it some style. I've got breeds here, and inside of breeds, I'm going to create another element. I'm going to call it inside. I'm going to say right inside here. I'm going to give this a style 2. And I'm going to give it some padding. I'll give this some padding as well. Okay, so now you can see that I've got one element inside of another element. But I'm listening on the outer element for when it is clicked. Now you'll notice that if I click inside, well, I'm still technically clicking breeds, right? I'm clicking the breeds element, even though the element that I actually clicked on was the element inside of breeds. But the element breeds event listener was called back. This event handler was called back. And this, in this case, isn't the actual element I clicked on, the target element that I actually interacted with, which was inside. It's instead the event handler it's the element whose event handlers are being dispatched. In this case, this, if I check its ID, should go up for ID, is breeds, right? But if I look at this event option, you can actually see it has a current target, which is breeds, and it has a target, which is the element that was actually clicked on. So we're going to come back a lot more to this, which is how event propagation works is how when an element or when an event is dispatched on the target element, it actually propagates to other elements, and we'll talk all about that later. But anyways, let's get back to the presentation. That's how you listen to an event, is with add event listener. So to remove an event listener, well, the browser provides a way to do that. But I think this is showing, what you cannot do. Okay, so there's a add event listener method, which we already saw, and there's a remove event listener that removes an event listener so that when this breeds element is clicked, this function will not be called. However, you cannot do this. You can't say, you can't pass an identical looking function and expect that function, the original function, to be removed. Let me just write this out to prove it. So if I were, so I've got my element, my breeds element, and I'm adding an event listener click and passing in a function. Now if I were to just copy naively, some people might think that if I were just to copy this function and call remove event listener, that when I clicked breeds, it should not be saying clicked because, hey, I removed that event listener. But you have to remember that this function is a different function in memory than this function. So you can't simply just write a function that looks the same. It has to be the same function in memory. So how can I, Mark, I'll ask you, how can I get, how can I actually remove an event listener?
So could you assign the anonymous function that you applied to the add event listener, click handler, could you assign that to a variable and then use that variable for remove event listener?
Yeah, absolutely. So I could call my function here, handler, and then instead of just putting the function in line in an add event listener, I could save it as handler. So that later I can pass that same function in memory to remove event listener. And now when I click this, nothing should happen.
I do have a question though. On add event listener, does it return anything? Does it return the handler so that I could ultimately assign the result of add event listener to the remove?
That's a really good question. There are actually listener objects, but I don't know if this returns anything. I don't know if I don't actually think it does return anything. Let's see. Does it? I mean, do you know? I mean, is this a leading question that you're asking? Or
No, actually, it's not a leading question.
Okay. It says undefined.
So probably no, doesn't return anything.
Yeah, I'm guessing not. Does not return. Now there are like handler objects or something that I think I once saw, but I've never used. There is something else there that you can like add event, like use to pass event handlers, but I forgot what that was. I have to look into that. There's some kind of event target objects or something like that that you can, I don't know, you can pass, but I've never used them, but I remember somehow reading about them once. But for the most part, yeah, this is how everybody listens to an event and stops listening to an event. So yeah, this just kind of repeats what I said is the fix to passing the same, when you need to pass the same function, well, you always have to save your function, then use it to register and then unregister your event handler. Okay, so now we're going to do the exercise. We're going to add, make a lightweight version of jQuery's bind and unbind, which lets you listen to an event on an element to our version of jQuery. This should just loop through and register this event handler on every element inside the collection and unregister it on every element in the collection when unbind is called. So if you're working through these problems on your own, now's a good time to pause. If not, I'm going to implement it in my version of jQuery.
A quick question about the requirements that you were just setting up there.
Mm-hmm.
Unbind, we don't need to capture the handler reference like we were just talking about with add event listener or remove event listener. We will remove any handlers that are registered to click.
No, it's past the function. So it's not going to remove all click event handlers, if that's what you mean.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah, that's something that jQuery, so jQuery, you can with jQuery just write, it does allow you to write just unbind click, and that would actually unregister all event handlers on these elements, or all click handlers, no matter how they're like with, you could have registered a bunch of different functions for the click events on these elements, but this would unregister all of them. However, I don't encourage people to use this technique, because you never know if there's some other library or some other module or like file is listening on your element. And if they are, you might be inadvertently unbinding them, which could be bad, right? They still might need their click event handler. So I always try to be very careful about events that I'm binding and unbinding, and make sure I'm only doing what I know, like I'm only unbinding things that I know about, which means you can't use this, which is so syntactically nice, and it does mean you have to kind of keep a reference and then always pass it, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So, yeah. Let's do this. So I'm highlighting HTML. Here's my test. I'm not going to auto run it. And I'm going to add the bind function, which is really going to be easy. This is going to take an event name and a handler. And, oh, there's no unbind function here, which I will add, but I'll write bind in a second. This is going to go through every element in our collection. I'm going to go through every element in the collection, and this callback function will be called with the index and the elements. And for every element, I'm going to do add event listener. Write event name. I'm going to add the handler, and I'm going to put in false. So that looks good. And for unbind, I'm going to do pretty much the same thing. I'm just going to copy this, paste it, call it unbind, and instead of add event listener, I'm just going to do remove event listener. And with that, hopefully all my tests pass, and they don't. Well, let's see what I did wrong. Click it is not defined. Let's check it out. Where is click it? Click it. Let's see. It's possible that I did not author this test right. Client click it. Oh, I think this forgot to be included. Let me grab the click it code that simulates actually clicking an event handler. Oh, there it is. So I'll make sure I update the example with this. So this is actually, if you guys are curious, how to simulate an event, a native DOM event. It's kind of screwy. You can create the event, and it's got to be a special type of event. In this case, we're simulating a mouse event. And then I can initialize that event object with data about the event with these millions of arguments. And then on the element that I want to actually have be the target of the event, I will dispatch that event object on it. So with that, hopefully, our test passed. All right. So, sounds like Mick has been.
There we go. Yeah, I didn't want to necessarily interrupt you. Mick's got a good question, though.
So let's take a look at what Mick asked us. jQuery allows aliasing. Yes, that does work. So that's another technique jQuery used to. So here, let me blow it up. So you can read what. So Mick said jQuery allows aliasing. So what jQuery allows you to do is on an element, or on a collection, bind to click dot something. It's in some ways kind of like a namespace, and this allows you to then remove click event handlers, but only that use that namespace. This is, again, just a way. This is a way for users not to have to keep around this functional event handler, so that they can unbind it correctly. Yeah, that's a fine way of doing it. You still can potentially have conflicts. Like, it is possible that some other library or some other person used my something as a namespace, and you could have a collision, although in practice it's probably never going to happen. But most frameworks, at least CanJS, and most frameworks will take care of unbinding things for you when they're bound, so you don't really need to use this technique. But in a pinch, it's not so bad. So good comment, Meg. Okay, so where was I? Okay, so we finished the example. Now we're going to talk about basics of event handling, which we kind of already mentioned a little bit. Your callback functions, your handlers, are called back with an event object that has a lot of useful information on it. What was the actual event that was interacted with? What events? What was the element that was actually interacted with? What element is currently having its handlers dispatched? And there's also, it provides ways of, so there's information, and there's also some methods that allow you to control what the behavior of the element is, how it propagates through the DOM, the event, and how the, and if, like, a default action should happen. So again, we'll come back to this in next week's training. But for this week, we're going to go through all the different types of events that most browsers provide. Like, all browsers, kind of going back almost forever. I feel like there's a few additions we should throw in for this presentation. It could be updated, because I don't think it talks about input events, which is a very nice event that I don't think we've added. So let's take a look at it. Yeah, slider. Actually, what's the URL here? Lectures. I'm opening this page up right now. It looks like it's lectures. 3-day training, JS, there's nothing in it. Lectures, JS, demos, events, okay, there it is. Got it. All right, so this is a page that we should probably put up online somewhere that lets you play with all the different types of events that you can listen to on DOM elements, and will show the different data that's dispatched on the event object. And it allows you to hide all the special custom events, or custom data properties that different browsers add on. So let's go through them. This is divided into the different types of events, categories of events. There's mouse events that deal with when the mouse is moving. There's, or the user interacting with a mouse. There's HTML events that happen as, you can almost think of them as secondary events, right? A click is almost a secondary event, but it is in fact a primary event. where the user, well, let's do a true primary event, which is like mouse down, right? That's when the mouse as I'm unfortunately can't see me, as I press my mouse finger down on the mouse, that causes it to kind of make that clicking motion on the down. That's when a mouse down event happens, right? But an HTML event might happen as a secondary thing. If I refresh the page or I submit a form, well, I might submit a form by clicking the submit event, but there's secondary events that come out of certain HTML configurations, or certain things can cause HTML events. Those are secondary events. And then there's key events, what happened when the user interacts with the keyboard. And there's a few other events that we'll talk about, like jQuery's ready event, which is really DOM content loaded, but we'll come back to that. So let's go through the different events. So a click, again, happens when a user does a mouse down and a mouse up on the same element, which is kind of weird. So I can actually go down here, I'll move out, I'll come back, release, and that actually causes a click, right? So you can still move around and then come back and still fire off a click event. A double click is two sequential clicks, but they have to happen within like a second of each other. So click, click, that causes a double click. And I could, if I was fast enough, even do the same kind of moving out, moving in, and then double clicking. Context menu event is when the right mouse button is clicked. There's also, some browsers will dispatch click events where there's a button field will be updated. You can see this is button 2, button number 2. I wonder if I click in the middle, if I click my scroll, no, that doesn't seem to fire it. Mouse down when the mouse button is pressed down. Mouse up when the mouse button is raised. Mouse over when a mouse moves from one element into the target element that you're listening to. Mikhail asked a good question. Let me do my best to explain that. So what is the actual difference between element.bind and element.on? And why are you using element.bind? The reason why I'm doing element.bind is because element.bind only, well, the reason is element.on allows you to use event delegation, which we'll talk about next week. That is a much more complex function to implement. Now in jQuery's core, when you call bind underneath the hood, that calls on. But bind's API is much more simple to implement, so that's why we're using element.bind. But in reality, you can use element.on. I would actually use element.on everywhere in jQuery code that I was authoring. I just don't want to get into that quite yet with this training. But very good question. Anyway, so what I was saying about, there's these mouse enter, mouse leave, mouse out, mouse move, right? These are kind of two very similar events, but you should almost always use mouse enter, mouse leave, and almost never use mouse out, mouse move. And the reason is the difference in when they get called. Mouse out and mouse move, let's call it mouse move. My mistake, everybody. Mouse over and mouse out, or mouse enter and mouse leave. Mouse over is called whenever a mouse moves over some other element into your element. But it can also be called when you're on a child element of the element you're listening to mouse over on, and you move from that child element to the parent. I think there's a demo here, actually. So it's just easiest to explain down here. So on the left here, it's using mouse enter, mouse leave. And on the right here, it's using mouse over, mouse out. So you can see here, as I mouse over, the mouse over count increases. and as I leave, the mouse out increases. But watch what happens as I go. I'm going to go from the outside in, and then I'm going to go to a child. You can see mouse over is still called, and mouse out. As I go back and forth between these are called, which you almost never want. You really just want to know when an element is inside you, or sorry, when your mouse is inside you. You don't really care if it goes inside of another child. So that's how mouse enter, mouse leave works. So it'll mouse enter, but I haven't caused a mouse leave until I actually exit. So you almost always want to listen to mouse enter, mouse leave, never mouse over, mouse out. Now you might be thinking, when is a case that you want to listen to mouse over, mouse out? That's a good question. I feel like I have listened to it before, where I've had some kind of strange behavior where I had like a pop-up window that was kind of opening, and I wanted to know that was like I think it was like a nested kind of like a nested tree menu, and the children would open up as children of the LIs on the left here. You can kind of think of a tree menu where you mouse go to one item, then it opens up to the right, and you go to that, and then that opens up to the right. And in that case, everything to the right was in fact a child of the items to the left that I was displaying. So that's why mouse enter, mouse leave would not work. I had to use mouse over, mouse out. So those are the mouse events. Now let's talk about the HTML events. So there's a load event, window on load, that you can listen to. And that happens when everything in the page has fully loaded, meaning every image has loaded, anything with a frame set which nobody uses, but it's really images, styles, and JavaScript have all completed loading. That's the window load event will fire. Nobody listens to this anymore because you don't want to have to wait for all images to load to add JavaScript behavior to your page. Instead, you listen to the DOM content loaded event, which is the same as listening to jQuery's ready event. The DOM content loaded lets you know when all of your HTML has actually been loaded, but images and things like that haven't been loaded. So you can listen to that. That's a really good one to listen to. Unload, and there's also before unload, which isn't listed here, occurs when someone is leaving the page, like hitting the refresh button or something like that, or clicking to a different page. That's commonly used to put up an alert saying, are you really sure you don't want to save your data before you leave the page? That's what those events can be used for. Abort is used. I've never had to actually listen to that event, but if like I hit reload a page and someone hits the stop button before everything is loaded, you can listen to the abort will be fired. Never actually had to listen to that event. The error event handler happens when it can happen if you're listening to error on an image element. So I can actually create an image element and listen to its register an error event handler. And that fires if something goes wrong with the image loading. But most commonly, you listen to window.error, which fires whenever a JavaScript exception happens that reaches essentially that bubbles all the way up to the the window scope. And this can be very good for error detection, right? So everybody listens to errors on the server. Not everybody listens to errors on the client, which is really important. So you can listen to window.add event listener, add an error. Let me make this bigger. Hopefully this works in Chrome. For a long time, Chrome never implemented this. Let's see what happens if it actually picks this up. I have a feeling it might not. We'll see. So here I'm listening to when an error happens in console logging error. Did not do it. My guess is that's because I'm running in the console here and not not in the actual page. But what you could do here inside these window on errors is do an AJAX request to your server with the details of the error to let you know that, hey, there's some JavaScript code that's breaking. That's really useful. So the select happens when a user selects text in a text field. So here you can see I'm selecting text, and then that fires. Change happens kind of different depending on your control. So if I change a select element, change fires. Or when I change a radio or checkbox, why is that not fire? Okay, it is working. It fires right away. Text is the exception. If I change text, okay, I just changed it, the change event doesn't fire until this text element loses focus. So, and then if I deleted this and added this, which I actually affected no change, well, it still doesn't fire. So it kind of waits till the user is done before the change event is fired on an input element. Submit events are fired when the user hits a submit button or they hit enter inside of an input element.
Justin?
Yes.
On the change event for the input element, I think I missed what you had said. If I don't change the text, but I lose focus on the element, is there any diffing or whatnot for the data that's inside that input element to actually fire before it fires the event?
So if you actually change it and lose focus, well, then it fires a change event. But if you were to change it and then kind of change it back, let me do that again. Change it and then change it back, it doesn't fire a change event.
Okay, so the text, the data inside literally has to change.
Yes.
Before. Okay, good.
Yeah. So yeah, like I said, submit events happen when someone clicks a submit button, which actually submits the form. The alternative is that if they hit the enter button inside of a focused input element, let's see if it does it when I do this. Yeah, so even if I have a focused input element and I hit the enter key, that submits the form. So just be aware of that. There's kind of two different ways of submitting a form. It's not just clicking the button. A focus event happens when an input element gets focused, right? So focus, when you can see that the browsers will draw by default a little outline around any focused element. And when that happens, you get a focus event. You can also tab to an element to get it focused, besides clicking on it. And as you can see, blur happens when an element is focused and it loses focus, which can happen by either programmatically with JavaScript, with the user using the tab key, or by you clicking away from that element. Resize, the resize event occurs only on the document, and that occurs when the document is actually resized. If an element is resized, if I were to change the width or height of this element, a resize event is not fired. Again, it's only when the window changes its size. If you are doing needing to do a lot of resizing when the window resizes, that cannot be accomplished with CSS. jQuery++'s resize event is actually really nice. It allows you to listen to resize on any element and kind of hopefully set up the right behavior. The scroll event happens when an input element is scrolled. Now, we're going to talk about bubbling and how all of these events, you saw earlier, I could listen to a parent event for when its child is clicked on, right? I could listen on Breed's click, even though inside was actually what was clicked on. The rare exception to all of this is you cannot listen on a parent for when a child is scrolled. These events do not bubble, which can make certain things a little tricky to figure out, but just be aware of that. Key events, those happen as the user is hitting their keyboard, and there's key down happens just like mouse down as the user, well, it actually fires off differently on Macs than in PCs, which is super obnoxious. In PCs, as you hold the key down, only one key down event is fired, just like what happens with a mouse. But with a Mac, as I hold key down here, you can see it kind of repeating multiple times, because Macs have this interesting little way to pick different vowels, and they don't repeat the same letter multiple times. Key press happens as a key is written into the page. In the case of PCs, Windows, by default, as I hold down the letter A, if I just keep holding it down, multiple letter A's will be written to the page. But that's not the case for Macs, which only one key press is fired no matter how long I hold the anchor event. This makes making video games and things like that matter with key events matter a lot, super obnoxious, especially as like, hey, if I'm holding the up arrow, I'd like to know, how long they held it for, or that kind of thing. You can't rely on key press as kind of a constant interval, being dispatched at some kind of constant interval, even though that's its behavior on PCs. Just all the key event stuff is just very weird in cross-browser, and I just suggest finding other libraries that help you manage it. Key up is supposed to happen when you release the key. So as I release, I'm going to hold J, holding J, holding J, releasing J, then key up happens. And finally, the input element event happens as a new character is written. This is kind of the standard way of listening as the user is actually kind of making changes. See, if I hit left and right, no input happens, but as I add characters, it does. So that's a really useful event. So, and then finally, we talked about jQuery has a ready event, which is effectively the same as listening to the DOM content loaded event. To listen to with jQuery, some pseudo code here. You can kind of, the most common way people listen to the ready event is actually pass a function to jQuery like this. And if you pass a function to jQuery, it's actually the code inside here will be run after the DOM content loaded or the ready event has been fired. I don't like writing this actually because I feel like to a brand new user, this has got to be super, super duper confusing. So the way that I'll write it is document dot either on or with the bind method ready, and then a function. To me, it's worth the extra code to explain so people know what they're talking about. So Mikhail asked a really good question. Where was it? Find me. What did I do with my hitter room?
He said, does it mean that most cross-browser way of catching key events is key up?
So, no, well, it depends on what you want to be listening for, right? Or what you're trying to do. Yes, listening to key up is a good way of, if you want to see what the last, it'd be interesting, hopefully jQuery, I mean, if you want to go all the way back in time, I don't think jQuery has an input polyfill. That would be really nice if it had that, so that even in like IE6, you could listen to the input event. If jQuery it didn't have that last time I checked, but I haven't checked for like IE6 and 7 compatibility for input compatibility in a very long time, so things might have changed. If jQuery provides an input event that's like, polyfilled and works in every browser, then definitely use that. Short of that, yes, I would say that the key up event is the historical way of you listen. If you want to know what the kind of last thing that someone typed was, you would listen to key up and then check like what has changed in the input element. Is kind of the old school way of doing it. It's a very good question. Okay, so I think with that we are done for we're done for today. When we come back, we're gonna talk about like how events actually move through the DOM, the default actions there. Just kind of give a preview. The data that elements or events actually dispatch on them, which you can see here. But we'll talk about what the most important of these properties mean. And then, we'll talk about all about the propagation, which is really that I feel like is the most important thing to really get an understanding of how the browser works with events. And then if we have time, we'll actually implement on and a little bit of event delegation ourselves, or at least I will implement it and you guys can watch, which will be cool. Cool. So if there's any, there was that question that I wanted to get back to, but now I've lost my Gitter. Oh, here's my training room here. So if anybody has any questions right now about anything related to JavaScript programming, it's a good time to ask. But right now I'm going to answer Pyrox's question. Is it possible to create so he said, I watched the training video about this and the proto chain. My question is it possible to create an object's proto to a merge of two other objects' prototypes? Not even a merge, maybe a set of some prototypes of two or more objects, right? So this is like, what he's effectively asking is like, can you set up something like multiple inheritance? And the answer is yes, but the answer is no to can you do it elegantly. So you can't actually have two different objects on the proto chain. I wish I had my camera set up, but the best that I can do is there a quick draw, like what's a drawing application that I can just sketch something out with? You know anything, Mark? Like online? Like is there a paint?
That's a good question.
All right, let's see if this lets me try it. Hopefully this is decently, can I make this bigger? Yeah, this will work. Okay, so let's talk about, so remember the proto chain kind of thing. So if we remember that, oh boy, let's pencil. Okay, so remember there was the object prototype object. Or sorry, let's not start with that. Let's talk about the array prototype object. And that's going to have some methods on it, like join and splice. So, oh boy, join, let's say this is splice. This isn't so bad. All right, so this is the array prototype object. Now we have, let's say we had our jQuery, we have our version of jQuery, which is kind of array-like, or let's just say we have, maybe not our version of jQuery. Let's go back to that and say we have our animal we have our animal prototype object. And this had, I think, because it was an animal, it had a toString or something, and I think it had an eats method. So we can draw them out. This is going to be a horrible drawing, but hopefully you guys get what I'm going for. Okay, now what you're asking is it possible to set up multiple inheritance between, this is the animal prototype, and the this is the array prototype. So I'm going to just do animal for this, and this is array. I have an AR for array prototype. Okay. Now the short answer is not, well, like I said, not elegantly, because what you would really want is an object whose proto is going to point to one of these two, but then that proto chain will continue to the other one. Now, the problem is that you can do it if it's something that, well, you can't do this because what you're going to do is you're going to make, by setting the proto here, I'm just going to do PR for proto and PR for proto here. So this needs both of these things on its proto chain. The problem what you've done though is that this was, I think I got this wrong. This should be an AR. And this is AN. Yeah, okay, AN, here we go. Now it kind of looks a little bit better. So animal, now if the only way that you could do this would be to make animal's proto point to array's proto. But then what you've done is you've made animal inherit from array. And you wouldn't want to do that. You don't want to change the behavior of animal simply because this external thing wants to inherit from both array and animal. So there's only a single proto path that you can define. You can't have it go kind of multiple places. That's the rub. You can't do that. However, what you could do is if I had animal, and that's a function, and I've got my animal prototype that I'm adding things to, and I've got what's the other one? Array. Well, array has its thing. Well, we can just assume that, like, hey, we implemented array ourselves. So now I wanted this, like, we'll just call it X, that I wanted to inherit from both of these things. Well, the best way to probably do it would be to copy essentially all of these functions over. So I could do X is equal to function, and then with our extend that I created, I could do something like $.extend x.prototype. I want to add in everything on animal.prototype.
And subsequently array.
And then subsequently array.
So you're basically mixing in animal and array into this new object X.
Yeah, exactly. So you could do that. This is a good way. Plus, then this way you can kind of control, like, array is overwriting animal. So you can kind of array wins. But you're not going to get the benefit of the proto chain lookup. And this is but that's not so bad. Really, you only have to copy these properties over once. So I don't know. This is how I would do it. But a good question. Cool. Are there any others? I think that's it. Great. So Mark, thank you very much for joining me. Thanks everybody else, and make sure you guys come in next week because that's going to be the fun week where like there's going to be a lot of stuff that if you're interested in how events work, where we'll do a really deep dive, and you'll probably have really good fundamentals on how events propagate through the DOM. And yeah, thanks again for coming. Make sure you subscribe to this video and give us a like on Twitter and follow Bitovi on Twitter. Cool.
Thanks for the training, Justin.
Thanks, Mark. All right, bye.